it's the third time, really, that I've been utterly devastated by being in that courtroom. First was when Bradley talked about his torture. Secondly, when he talked about why he leaked the documents and gave his political reasons. And this time, the scene was, imagine a small, antiseptic-looking courtroom. You have Bradley Manning sitting at the table between very large people, including his lawyer, looking very diminutive, but very dignified. And you have, 16 of us in the courtroom, plus a bunch of prosecutors and a few sketch artists and press. And the government opens with a slideshow. And the slideshow is about how we are going to convince the court, it's only a judge trial, that Bradley Manning aided the enemy, just dumped millions of documents, has nothing good to say about him, and we're going to put him away for life. I mean, they didn't say that, but that's what happens if he's convicted. So your first impression of that is one, he's already pleaded guilty to 20 years, that he could get 20 years for. So what are they doing? If you saw this in a country the U.S. claims is a dictatorship, and you saw a truth teller getting up and saying, this is what my country's doing, and then the country gave him 20 years, and then they went ahead and wanted to put him in life, people would be screaming. And people ought to be screaming about this.
Couldn't he actually face the death penalty?
Yes. One of the charges, the aiding the enemy charge, which we shouldn't talk about, carries a death penalty. The prosecutor has said they're not going to ask for the death penalty, but I think it's still open to the judge to give him the death penalty. This is really serious, and it's outrageous. I mean, it's really hitting Bradley in a way that he should just not be hit. Apart from the bigger issue of the people that we should be looking at are the people who committed the war crimes that Bradley Manning exposed. That's where the accountability should come in here, not about a soldier who acted on his conscience and acted because he wanted to have the American people see what America is doing. So this was, it would be surreal. It looked like, I'd love it to have not really been happening in front of me, but there it was, these slides going across. And in addition to what's going to happen to Bradley Manning because of this, or I hope it doesn't, but the life sentence, the aiding the enemy charge, which we mentioned here, what they're really saying in that is that by giving documents to WikiLeaks, a publisher, or could have been the New York Post or the New York Times, somebody somewhere in the world who's an enemy of the United States is going to read those documents, and therefore a soldier who is a whistleblower is automatically aiding the enemy. If he talks to you, if he talks to the press anywhere, that's aiding the enemy according to our government. That's really an incredibly outrageous reading of the statute. The judge has gone a little bit toward requiring the government to prove a little more, but I think you have to have the intent to aid the enemy. But the government isn't saying that at all. So the government's conception, which you opened the show with, that he dumped millions of documents, was just belied, really, by what Coombs said. One little detail which I like, which shows where Bradley Manning was coming from. He had a dog tag on, not then, but when he was in the military in Iraq, and on the back of the dog tag it had the word humanist stamped on it. This is the Bradley Manning that this world and this country ought to care about. So one danger is to Bradley Manning. A second one is to the idea that we're ever going to have a whistleblower again who talks to the media, even if a whistleblower says something like, I'm not getting good body armor in Iraq, which actually happened with Rumsfeld, not a whistleblower, just a soldier. That soldier could be arguably aiding the enemy. And a third aspect of this trial that's really serious.
Because he could be letting that soldier who says we're not getting good body armor could be letting the enemy know that they are vulnerable because they don't have good enough body armor.
That's exactly right, Amy. So this happens all the time. And a third aspect, of course, that I was sitting there in shock by was laced throughout this proceeding was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. They first claimed that he was giving direction to Bradley Manning. Then they claimed that Bradley Manning was using his wanted list, the so-called WikiLeaks wanted list, which was actually put together not by WikiLeaks, but by NGOs and human rights organizations.
Meaning, what was the wanted list? The
wanted list is a list of documents that WikiLeaks had up that said these are the documents that might be interesting. I don't recall the exact words. That would be interesting to reveal to the public. And that list is put together by human rights groups, NGOs, put on the WikiLeaks website. So a lot of this was threaded through with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And that aspect was fascinating because it's the third point that I think is really important, is they're trying to get journalists in as co-conspirators or aiding and abetting their sources. They started with Julian Assange. This trial is, in fact, in part, perhaps a large part, about getting journalists like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And I know you've discussed it here. When James Rosen of Fox, the government looked at James Rosen's phone records, and they did it with an affidavit that said he is a co-conspirator or an aider and abetter of his source. So we're talking about...
James Rosen is the Fox reporter who got information about North Korea, and the government went after him, apparently got a subpoena for his emails, and apparently Eric Holder himself, the Attorney General, approved the investigation of him.
That's correct. But the key way they got it was by saying he is a co-conspirator or aider and abetter of his source. So you have here Fox News, which was ready to bury Julian Assange as a quote co-conspirator or solicitor or whatever they wanted to call him, now has one of their own. So hopefully it will make Fox and other media understand there is a major attack on truth tellers, on journalists, and this trial really encapsulates that. The sad part is there's a human being at the center of this, a human being who David Coombs, his lawyer, pointed out not only wore a humanist dog tag, but didn't do a dump here. This was not a dump. He had access to hundreds of millions of documents, as you said in the opening to this show. He could have dumped, if he was going to dump, millions of documents, but that's not what he did. What he did was he selectively looked at documents, and he did two things. These are things that my conscience bothers me about when we're murdering and killing people and committing war crimes. And secondly, he made sure that those were documents that were not going to harm U.S. forces. So when you look at the Iraq war logs, which are the daily logs of what happens in the field, all those are, within 72 hours, they're not really relevant anymore. And that's the kind of material. He wanted to ensure that this was not going to harm our troops, but open the discussion in the United States. This truth teller is who the United States decides they're not just going to take the 20 years, they're going to put in jail for life. And
wasn't the Pentagon the WikiLeaks offered the Pentagon to vet the documents before they released them if it was going to endanger anyone, and they refused? Yes,
WikiLeaks went to the Pentagon and said, we're going to release these documents. This was the diplomatic cables in particular. Actually, it may have been more than that. And can you vet them? And they refused. So, but there was nobody's ever alleged here there was any real harm to U.S. soldiers, to informants, et cetera. That's never been a claim. There's no blood on the hands of either of these, either Julian Assange or WikiLeaks.